So I'm a psychiatrist, and I study cities, at which point people usually look at me very puzzled. And then they say, so you study the amount of mental illness in cities. And I say no, and then they are really more puzzled. And then I say, no, I study mental health, and then they say, oh, schizophrenia, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's what mental health means, is disease. And I'm like, no, actually I'm really interested in health. And then they completely have no idea what I do, so they wander off. Usually my cocktail party conversations are very short. So my challenge here is to make you all interested in what I'm going to say next, because probably by now you're like, ugh, I don't even know what she's talking about. So the concept of resilience I see as a psychiatrist makes people feel happy. And America is kind of a feel-good society. And I think one of the reasons I love the conversation about, why has this idea taken off so much in the past 3 years, is that we're having all these problems, but we're resilient, and that means we're going to make it. And so what I want to talk about is the dark underside. So I would really like you to allow me to take you to the dark, to the hidden, to the shadow of all this, like what we are refusing to bring into consciousness. Because I think if we don't bring this part into consciousness, we will not succeed. It will have quite the opposite effect. But this is very uncomfortable for people, so I'm really glad that after this panel is over, we'll have time for thinking about our breath and being centered in our bodies. And so, with your permission, I want to go into the problem of disaster in the context of unmitigated disaster. So life in the United States for working people, for people of color, for women, for gay people, for people who are differently abled, is really an unmitigated disaster. And it's not just one disaster, but it's many disasters, none of which are mitigated. So when disaster falls, it doesn't fall on a fresh, snowy field. It falls on this history, what Andrew so aptly put, the accretion of generations of decisions, all of which have been unmitigated disasters. So this is that house in Union Beach. Ron had actually asked me to tour with some scientists related to NOAA, and so we got to Union Beach, and just as we pulled up, my phone rang, so I wasn't looking at where we were. And the phone call was from, did I want to be on, I'm blocking the name of that thing, but it does video.
YouTube?
No. Anyway, news. The Huffington Post. Huffington does video things. And there had just been shootings on 2 college campuses that day. So, I was talking about this and hearing these stories, and it's kind of shocking, shootings on 2 college campuses. And so I was in that space of that pain of violence among our children, and I got out of the car and I looked to the left, and there was that house. And just at that moment, a truck drove by, and a guy screamed at us, "Go back home. You don't belong here." So that's what I want to talk about. I love the term going from me to we, but what I want to say is that it's not true that the United States was always such an I society. And certainly minority communities have had huge traditions of we. That's how they survived. But the policies of our nation that have undermined our cities have also been specifically directed at destroying our cities via the route of destroying poor, minority, and working class communities. And in the process of destroying those neighborhoods, they have destroyed the social networks. The networks are ripped apart, and this has taken those communities from we to I. For psychiatry, and especially for my discipline, which is social psychiatry, there is nothing more important than this connectedness. That what is the basis, we believe, for health is dense networks of people who have, as was said, all of those great capacities to respect each other, to include each other, to look out for the vulnerable. That we-ness is the basis of all health. It's not simply nicer. Without that, you have no health. And so a society that destroys that destroys the very foundation, the very capacity to produce anything. We have had an extraordinary series of policies directed at the construct of we-ness. And the ones that I've studied include urban renewal, which, in the 1950s, 2,500 urban renewal projects were carried out in 1,000 American cities. 2/3 of the people who were displaced were African American. And it came to be known in my community and many other black communities as urban renewal is Negro removal. People said that, but it obviously wasn't a joke. If you, by simple ratio, one gets that it's possibly 1,600 African American communities that were demolished. These were large, important, big communities. That was bad, but these neighborhoods were neighborhoods that people had moved to during the Great Migration because they were concentrations of unskilled work. So the Great Ghetto in Chicago, the Great Ghetto in Pittsburgh, the Great Ghettos in New York, these became populated with people from the South, from the rural South, because there were manufacturing jobs. And so deindustrialization, which takes off right after World War II and which has led to a precipitous decline in our manufacturing capacity, also meant that about this time, it was becoming very, very difficult to get work. That is, of course, at the same time, or as that was becoming a very serious problem, planned shrinkage and disinvestment began to be instituted as policies. And gradually, everything was taken out. We talk about places that are food deserts, but they were not food deserts. They were made to be food deserts. I was working in Bayview Hunters Point in that neighborhood when the last institution of any significance, a branch of Wells Fargo Bank, left. There was no supermarket, there was no place to buy coffee, there was no bank, there was nothing. All of those institutions had been taken out in a systematic way, and those communities were allowed to crumble. As a physician, I've been involved in watching one of the products of that, what we call mad plagues, a series of uncontrolled epidemics, which were deliberately left to fester in these neighborhoods. The AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, the violence related to crack epidemic, the mental illness related to violence related to crack epidemic, the asthma epidemic, and the obesity epidemic. There was a deliberate moment in United States policy when it was possible to do a broad-scale public health intervention to control the crack epidemic. And it was decided instead to do a war on drugs, which led to mass criminalization, creating yet another turn of the screw. What is fundamentally important to recognize is that all of these policies are tearing apart the same neighborhoods and pushing people, displacing people, reorganizing their communities, fracturing the we. None of these disasters is ever mitigated. And therefore, although people are self-organizing systems, they do try to get it back together, there's never full recovery before the next blow has hit. This is the history of the American city over the past 60 years. This means that the social organization of these places changes steadily over that period of time. There's a Pittsburgh researcher, Eva Maria Sims, who looked at this in a very straightforward way. She asked people who grew up in the Hill District between 1930 and 2004, what did you play? What did you like to play when you were a kid? What was it like? She actually expected them to say, we played hoops, we played hopscotch, we played jacks. But what she heard was the way in which the social organization of the neighborhood drastically changed from a first period, what I've come to call Sims 1, when it was we, to a last period, what I've come to call Sims 3, which is characterized by what one of her observers calls unexpectancy. You go outside, you look to the left, you look to the right, you don't know what's going to happen next, unexpectancy. It is, I think, important to just pause a little bit to say that this is we. This is the Hill District's Irene Kaufman Settlement House. And in the Maslow's hierarchy, when basic needs are met, we're able to satisfy existential desires. And these children are learning how to paint. And the calm and peace and serenity of this is characteristic. There are tens of thousands of photographs of this neighborhood that substantiate that this is not an isolated moment. It happens that there was a photographer, Charles Teeny Harris, who left an archive of 80,000 photographs now at the Carnegie Museum of Art, easily accessible online. And you can see the diversity, the intensity, the charisma of this neighborhood, which we all know about more or less through August Wilson's plays. Urban renewal was the first massive attack on this neighborhood and sheared off what's called the Lower Hill, which was this dense neighborhood. Because there were waves of immigrants that had come into Pittsburgh and all had settled first in the Hill, it was a very multi-ethnic neighborhood. There are many kinds of European Orthodox churches and synagogues, and then the African Americans had come. But at that period, when this was being bulldozed, everybody was kind of living there together. This is a photograph by Teeny Harris, and I think it just very aptly captures in my own research, having had a chance to go and talk to people about what was this like, the desolation of having one's neighborhood demolished. What do you do next? What do you do with that? It's an impossible thing to integrate into the self. And I say that as a psychiatrist. There's nothing to be done with that kind of loss. It's too big, it's too confusing. And hence, the concept of resilience really annoys me, because I've heard so many stories of people losing large chunks of the way they live. And I stand totally humbled by what we face as people going into this thing that's going to happen of climate change. There is nothing more to be said than just to be humble in the face of what we're, and any cheerfulness about it, well, we're going to be resilient, we're Americans, we can overcome this. It's not what it's about. This is heartbreaking. You have no idea how heartbreaking this is. This is confusing. This is destructive. If we don't learn how to love each other, we are in so much trouble. But what we are in instead is a system of active hatred that's acted out all the time without any consequences, without any requirement that the people whose lives are destroyed must be compensated. So to me, we are heading into a perfect maelstrom of the American disease of racism and hatred at a time when what we need is compassion and love. And any bouncing back from that, the seriousness of that, I just worry that it's a delusional system, and I mean that literally, a delusional system that prevents us from looking at the seriousness, and that we use the word resilience so that we don't have to face the depth of the crisis. I don't know how we get through that denial, but I think the word resilience is part of a huge denial system. And our task is, as leaders, that lovely list of what is a leader, our task as leaders is to say to people, it's okay. We can face our history. We did that to our cities. Our cities haven't recovered from that, but it's okay, we can face it. We can cry together. We can sob, we can hug each other, we can say, please forgive me. And we can move forward together as a nation and save ourselves. But we as leaders have to help people look at this story. If we can't do that, we're going down. And so this, for me, became an emblematic poster. Many of you may have seen this. This is the kind of thing that, if you went to the driver's Department of Motor Vehicles, people would have in their cubicles, right, that don't ever give up. The frog trying to choke the bird that's trying to eat it. So it was on the wall of a building, and you can see, or maybe you can't, but at the top, the artist had added some pictures of despair, just the drugs that had taken over the community. You can see that the building is in shambles. It's a building that's since gone. We've worked a lot with a concept really elaborated by Thomas Hanchett in his book, Sorting Out the New South City, on the fact that American cities are sorted by race and class, and that this is something that didn't always exist. It is something that has emerged over time, and that we now live divided. And something happened. Oh, maybe I did it. I'm sorry, I did something terrible. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I never knew about that button before. See, now that's a very psychiatric button. It's the blanking button. That's the repression button, right? If you get tired of this, you just say, push the blanking button. So Lourdes Hernandez Cordero, who worked with me, we worked together on a project that NYC recovers after 9/11. One of the things that we were just struck by was what it was like for the city divided by race and class to respond to 9/11, especially given that Rudy Giuliani was the mayor. And so all the resources went to the elite and the other people were neglected. Even the major construct of 9/11, that it was about heroes and victims, was to exclude everybody else from their pain and their suffering and their experience. It is important, she drew this as kind of a circle that's divided, but I think it's important to think about it as vertical also, that there's this social and economic stratification. When disaster hits, it hits on this existing accretion of generations of process. Did I hit the blinking button again? Or is that all I had to say? It's possibly all I had to say. That's never all I have to say. I'm very talkative. This is where we are. This is where we are. And we didn't get there in any, it's not like we were always there. We got there through a process that has been violent, full of hatred, that has impoverished people, that has destroyed their communities, that has left them aching with trauma, that has made us violent in ways that are inconceivable. We have torn our guts out as a society, and we have taken no responsibility for it. We blame the victim. Why do you live in a nasty community? Why do you drink large bottles of soda? If you didn't drink large bottles of soda, you would not be fat. What kind of place is this? This is a ridiculous place. So we are called, I believe, to go deep. We are called to keep our hearts open in ways that we have never done. We are truly called to mindfulness of our common humanity, to learn what that is. In an apartheid society, I don't think we have any idea. What are the reflections, what are the meditations we do about people who are different, about otherness, and about, as they say in 12-step, identify, don't compare. How do we make that a practice in our whole society? The capacity for love is boundless, but we are not in a system of love. And that's the paradox of the coming era, the era that we're in. And how we come to have language for that strikes me as the great task that we find ourselves faced with. Thank you for your attention.